In New Hampshire, someone earning minimum wage would need to work 194 hours a week to afford a two-bedroom apartment. Read that again, 194 hours. There are 168 hours in a week. That's not a typo, and it's not a worst-case outlier. It's the actual math from the most cited housing affordability report in the country. And it's not the state you'd guess. Every year, a group called the National Low-Income Housing Coalition calculates something called the housing wage for every state, the hourly wage a full-time worker needs to earn to afford a modest two-bedroom rental without spending more than 30% of their income on it. Then they compare that number to each state's actual minimum wage and calculate how many hours a minimum wage worker would actually need to work per week to afford that same apartment. Most people, if you ask them to guess which states come out worst, would say California, New York, maybe Hawaii. They'd be wrong. And the reason why says a lot more about how this country actually works than a simple, expensive coastal city story. Let's start with the state everyone assumes is the worst, California. To afford a modest two-bedroom in California, you'd need to earn $49.61 an hour, the highest housing wage of any state in the country. If you're working minimum wage there, that means about 120 hours a week. That's genuinely brutal. 3 full-time jobs just to make rent. But here's the thing. 120 hours a week isn't even close to the worst number in this data. It's not top 10. It's not top 5. There are states with far cheaper rent than California where the math is actually worse. Texas, 164 hours a week. Georgia, 163. Utah, 162. All 3 have lower rents than California. All 3 have lower housing wages. And all 3 require more hours of minimum wage work to afford them. Why? Because California's minimum wage is $16.90 an hour. Texas, Georgia, and Utah all still pay the federal minimum, $7.25. So even though it costs less in absolute dollars to rent an apartment in Texas, a Texas minimum wage worker is earning less than half of what a California minimum wage worker earns per hour. The gap between rent and wages is what actually determines this number, not the sticker price of the apartment. This is the pattern that's about to get a lot more obvious. Back to New Hampshire. 194 hours a week, the actual worst number in the entire dataset, worse than California, worse than Texas, worse than every other state. New Hampshire has a reputation as a quiet, wealthy, low-tax New England state. It is not the state that comes up in conversations about a housing crisis, but its rents track the Boston metro, one of the most expensive housing markets in the country, while its minimum wage sits at the federal floor of $7.25. New Hampshire has never passed its own state minimum wage above that number. High cost of living rent combined with the lowest legal wage in the country. That combination is what produces the single worst affordability number of any state in America, and it's hiding in plain sight because nobody thinks to look for a housing crisis in New Hampshire. Now flip it. The states where minimum wage workers need the fewest hours, Missouri at 63, Nebraska at 64, South Dakota at 66, Arkansas at 69. These aren't cheap states by accident, and they're not high-wage tech hubs either. Missouri and Nebraska both raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour in 2026. That single policy change is doing the work, not lower rent, not a booming local economy. Put every state in this data set side by side, sorted from best to worst, and the pattern holds almost without exception. Every state in the bottom 10 has stayed at or near the $7.25 federal minimum. Every state in the top 10 has raised its own minimum well above it. The federal minimum wage has been $7.25 an hour since July 24, 2009. 17 years. The longest stretch without a change in its history. Rent didn't stay still for those 17 years. In every state on this list, it kept climbing. The states where minimum wage workers can still reasonably get by aren't the cheap states or the poor states. They're the states that did something about the gap. This was never really a story about California or New York being expensive. It's a story about which states let their minimum wage catch up to their rent and which ones didn't. Every number in this video came from NLIHC's 2025 Out of Reach report and each state's official 2026 minimum wage. Link and full state-by-state breakdown in the description if you want to check your own state. If a state you didn't expect showed up here, put it in the comments. And if you want the next one of these in your feed, subscribe. New breakdown every week.